It is 11:42 p.m. on December 29th, 1972. A Lockheed L-1011 TriStar is circling 20 miles west of Miami International Airport, 176 people on board. In the cockpit, 3 experienced men are staring at a single, burned-out light bulb worth about 20 cents. None of them are watching the altitude. For 8 minutes, the autopilot has been quietly disengaged, and the aircraft has been sinking 200 feet at a time toward the pitch-black swamp of the Florida Everglades below. This is the story of how a $2 indicator bulb, a distracted flight crew, and 8 minutes of silence brought down a jumbo jet and killed 101 people who never knew anything was wrong. To understand how, we have to go back to the beginning of the flight. Eastern Airlines Flight 401 departs John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York at 9:20 p.m., bound for Miami. It is a routine holiday season run, one of thousands Eastern flies every year. The aircraft is a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, registration N310EA. At the time, one of the most advanced airliners in the world. Wide-bodied, triple-engine, packed with cutting-edge avionics, the TriStar had entered commercial service barely a year earlier. Eastern Airlines had bet heavily on it, marketing the plane as the future of air travel. Quieter, smoother, safer. In command is Captain Robert Loft, 55 years old, a veteran with over 29,000 flight hours, one of Eastern's most senior pilots. Beside him sits First Officer Bert Stockstill. Behind them, monitoring the flight engineers panel, is Second Officer Donald Repo, a specialist known among colleagues for his technical precision. 3 professionals, nearly 90 combined years of aviation experience between them. At 11:32 p.m., the TriStar begins its final approach into Miami. The night is clear. Air traffic control clears the crew to descend. Everything about this flight so far is unremarkable. Then, as the landing gear is lowered, something small goes wrong. A single green light on the instrument panel, the light that confirms the nose landing gear has locked into position, fails to illuminate. It is statistically nothing. A burned-out bulb is one of the most common minor faults in commercial aviation. But on this particular night, in this particular cockpit, that tiny failure is about to set something in motion that no one on board will notice until it is far too late. At this point, the disaster is entirely avoidable. Nothing has actually failed. The gear itself has almost certainly extended and locked correctly. The aircraft's own systems suggest as much. But an unlit bulb in an era before modern redundancy checks is not something a crew can simply ignore. Federal regulations and plain caution demand certainty. So Captain Loft requests a holding pattern from Miami Approach Control, climbing back up to 2,000 feet to circle west of the airport, over the dark, unlit expanse of the Everglades, while the crew sorts out the light. At 11:34 p.m., Captain Loft engages the autopilot in altitude hold mode, locking the aircraft at 2,000 feet. This is a critical decision, and on paper the correct one. Let the machine fly the plane. Let the humans solve the problem. But therefore all 3 men now turn their attention downward, away from the flight instruments, toward the faulty bulb assembly in front of them. First Officer Stockstill begins trying to remove the small plastic light housing to check the bulb itself. It will not come loose easily. Second Officer Repo, the flight engineer, offers to check the landing gear a different way. By leaving his seat and climbing down into the avionics bay beneath the cockpit floor, where a small viewing port allows a technician to visually confirm, with a flashlight, whether the nose gear is physically down. He disappears through the hatch. What he does down there and what he sees will only be fully understood after the wreckage is recovered. At this point, the disaster is still avoidable. The autopilot is holding the aircraft steady. All 3 crew members are simply preoccupied. But then, at some point in this stretch of minutes, something almost imperceptible happens on the flight deck. A shift so small that not one of the 3 men notices it. Investigators would later determine that the autopilot's altitude hold function had disengaged, not through mechanical failure, not through any dramatic event. Almost certainly, a control column had been nudged accidentally by a fraction of a degree as one of the crew members shifted position or leaned toward the instrument panel. Enough pressure to silently kick the autopilot out of altitude hold and into a different mode, one that would let the aircraft's nose drift down. There was no alarm. There was no warning horn. The L-1011 system was designed to disengage silently in that particular mode, without a distinct oral alert distinguishing it from a deliberate pilot command. So the TriStar begins to descend, not violently, not even quickly. Just 200 feet a minute in a smooth, gentle arc, the kind of subtle sink that, on a black night over a swamp with no ground lights to judge altitude against, is almost invisible from the cockpit. Remember, every single person on this flight deck is a trained, capable professional. Remember, the aircraft's true landing gear status was, in all likelihood, completely normal the entire time. This is the disproportion at the heart of the story. A working aircraft, flown by a veteran crew, brought down not by mechanical catastrophe, but by a 20-cent bulb and 8 minutes of misplaced attention. At 11:40 p.m., Miami Approach Control radios the flight. Eastern, 4:01. How are things coming along out there? Captain Loft replies, almost casually, "Okay, we'd like to turn around and come back in." He does not know that his aircraft has already descended 900 feet below its assigned altitude. What happens in the next 90 seconds will determine whether 176 people live or die. At 11:41 p.m., 1 minute after Captain Loft's radio call, an altitude alert chime sounds faintly in the cockpit, a soft warning tone built into the L-1011 systems. It goes unremarked. The crew, still focused on the landing gear light, does not register it as significant. Imagine sitting in seat 14C on that flight. The cabin is calm. The seatbelt sign is on for a routine holding pattern. Flight attendants are moving through the aisles. No one on board, not the passengers, not even the crew, has any indication that the aircraft is now less than 500 feet above the swamp. At 11:42 p.m., First Officer Stockstill glances up from the light assembly and notices something wrong on the altimeter. His voice, preserved on the cockpit voice recorder, is sudden and sharp. "We did something to the altitude." Captain Loft responds immediately. "What?" "We're still at 2,000 feet, right?" Stockstill asks. The answer is no. The aircraft is not at 2,000 feet. It is barely above the tree line. At 11:42:12, the radio altimeter's warning tone begins to sound. At 11:42:24, Captain Loft calls for the throttles. "Hey, what's happening here?" 3 seconds later, before either pilot can arrest the descent, the L-1011 strikes the Everglades. The aircraft breaks apart on impact, plowing through sawgrass and shallow water at nearly 200 miles per hour, scattering wreckage across a wide stretch of swamp in the darkness. Of the 176 people aboard, 101 die, either on impact or in the hours that follow, some from injuries, some from drowning in the wreckage before rescuers can reach them through the dense, roadless terrain. 75 survive, a number that would almost certainly have been zero had the crash occurred in deeper water, or had it not been for the extraordinary efforts of local airboat operators and fishermen who, hearing the crash and seeing a faint glow on the horizon, raced out into the swamp that night, wading through mud and reeds to pull survivors from the wreckage before dawn. Second Officer Donald Repo, the flight engineer who had gone below to check the gear, is pulled from the wreckage alive but critically injured. He dies weeks later on January 11, 1973, becoming officially the 102nd victim of Flight 401. Remember, this entire disaster traces back to one detail. The landing gear had almost certainly been down and locked the entire time. The only thing that had actually failed in the truest sense was a bulb worth 20 cents. The National Transportation Safety Board arrives within days, facing an investigation complicated by geography alone. The crash site sits deep in the Everglades, accessible only by airboat and helicopter, wreckage half submerged in muddy water and dense vegetation. Investigators recover the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder largely intact. What the tapes reveal stuns them. There had been no mechanical catastrophe, no engine failure, no structural collapse. For nearly 2 full minutes, 3 trained professionals had methodically discussed a faulty light bulb while their aircraft silently sank toward the earth beneath them. But this is where the investigation delivers its second, more unsettling reveal, the one that would matter far more to the future of aviation than the bulb itself. Investigators pulled the nose landing gear assembly from the wreckage and examined it in detail. The gear was down. It was locked. It had been correctly extended the entire time. The crew's entire 90-second panic, their circling, their troubleshooting, all of it had been chasing a problem that did not exist. The true failure was never in the landing gear. It was a burned-out bulb, and nothing more. So what actually caused the crash? The NTSB's final report placed the cause not on any single mechanical fault, but on something far more human, the complete breakdown of cockpit coordination. All 3 crew members had become absorbed in the same minor problem at the same time, and in doing so, no one had been left to fly the airplane. The autopilot's silent disengagement, likely triggered by inadvertent contact with the control column, had gone completely unnoticed because not one set of eyes remained on the primary flight instruments. This finding would become one of the most consequential in the history of commercial aviation. Flight 401 is now taught in nearly every airline training program in the world as the textbook case for a concept that, at the time, did not yet formally exist: crew resource management, or CRM. The discipline of ensuring that in any cockpit, someone is always flying the aircraft, no matter how urgent the distraction. There is one more strange footnote to this story, one that has nothing to do with engineering. In the years after the crash, Eastern Airlines salvaged usable components from the wreckage of Flight 401 and installed them in other L-1011 aircraft in its fleet. Soon afterward, Eastern flight crews began reporting sightings, apparitions resembling Captain Loft and Flight Engineer Repo, appearing in galleys and cockpits of the very planes that now carried their salvaged parts. The story spread so widely it inspired a 1976 book, The Ghost of Flight 401, and a television film. Eastern Airlines never confirmed the sightings, and no evidence beyond crew testimony exists. But the legend endured for decades, a strange cultural echo of a very real tragedy. The lasting impact of Flight 401 was not a redesigned light bulb. It was a redesigned cockpit culture. In the years that followed, the aviation industry, led by NASA research and adopted globally by airlines and regulators, developed crew resource management as a formal, mandatory training discipline, teaching pilots that authority in the cockpit must be balanced with communication, that junior crew members must speak up, and that at all times, someone's sole responsibility is monitoring the aircraft's basic flight path, regardless of what else demands attention. Altitude alert systems were also re-engineered industry-wide to be louder, more distinct, and harder to ignore than the soft chime that went unheard in the TriStar's cockpit that night. Every time you board a modern airliner and hear a pilot calmly hand off tasks with the words, "You have the aircraft," or "I have the controls," you are hearing the direct legacy of Eastern Airlines Flight 401, a protocol built from the wreckage of a swamp in South Florida, designed to ensure that no crew ever again loses an airplane while solving a problem worth 20 cents. 101 people died so that the world's pilots would learn a simple, permanent rule. Someone must always be watching the sky. Somewhere in aviation history, there is always another disaster caused by a detail this small. A missed bolt, a forgotten checklist, a single number misread under pressure. If you want to understand how, subscribe, and we'll keep uncovering them.